All right, so you're here because, well, your brain loves a puzzle, and honestly, so does mine. We're going to try to untangle how political violence, specifically firing squads, have been used, throughout history. You sent over some fascinating sources for this deep dive, and there's a lot to unpack.
Well, it is fascinating. This tactic, it seems so brutal, right?
Hmm.
So archaic, but it keeps popping up in different places in time.
Exactly, and we're going to look at some infamous examples like Hitler, Stalin, Franco, but also touch on some lesser-known instances like the British government's response to Irish rebels.
Yeah.
That will bring it up to the present. With Donald Trump's controversial statements about Liz Cheney, it's about understanding the historical context and how rhetoric can escalate.
Yeah, not taking sides.
Yeah.
Just trying to
I
understand
hear it.
the history of it.
Okay, let's start with the Spanish Civil War. The source, A Spanish Genocide, really lays out the groundwork for understanding Franco's rise to power and the brutal repression that followed. It's chilling to see how firing squads were used so systematically, much like we saw with Hitler's regime.
It's almost like a blueprint, isn't it? It's like almost every dictator uses the same playbook.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets interesting. You'd think that as a dictator consolidates power, the violence would just keep escalating, right? But this source reveals a surprising trend. While executions were common under Franco, they actually declined as his regime became more institutionalized.
Hold on. Really?
Uh,
That seems counterintuitive. Why would that be?
It appears that Franco initially relied heavily on extrajudicial killings, almost like a Wild West scenario.
Wow.
But as his regime solidified, there was this shift towards military tribunals. And these tribunals, although often rigged, at least gave a veneer of legal process and allowed the regime to control and even statistically track the repression.
So it's like in a twisted way, creating a system, even a system designed to eliminate opposition, actually resulted in fewer outright executions.
Yeah, it's like bureaucratic efficiency
Yeah,
applied to terror.
right.
Of course, this doesn't make the Franco regime any less horrifying. They still justified their actions by claiming they were necessary to restore order and eliminate enemies of the state. It's a tactic we see time and time again throughout history.
Right. It's scary how often violence is framed as a necessary evil, a means to an end. This source also mentions that the debate over Franco's legacy is still raging in Spain today.
There's this movement dedicated to historical memory that's been pushing to expose the crimes of the Franco regime.
Right.
They've been exhuming mass graves and demanding accountability. It's fascinating to see how the past continues to haunt the present.
Definitely makes you think about how we choose to remember or forget certain parts of history. Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about Stalin. He wasn't a fascist like Franco or Hitler, but he also used firing squads on a massive scale during the Great Purge in the 1930s.
Absolutely. Our excerpt from Wikipedia on the Great Terror highlights just how sweeping Stalin's purges were. He eliminated not just political rivals, but anyone perceived as a threat, including intellectuals, artists, even entire ethnic groups.
It's mind-boggling to think about the scale of it. Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, was one of the first to really expose the extent of the atrocities, though the exact death toll is still debated by historians.
What's important to understand here is that regardless of their specific ideology, totalitarian regimes, whether fascist or communist, often share this chilling willingness to use extreme violence to hold on to power.
A pattern that's sadly all too common throughout history. And, it's not just dictators who have resorted to these tactics. The British government's suppression of the Irish Rebellion also involved the use of firing squads, as you mentioned earlier. They saw the rebels as a threat to their authority and stability.
It's a reminder that even governments that we might consider democratic can, under certain circumstances, employ brutally repressive methods. The lines can get blurry, especially during times of conflict or perceived national crisis.
That's a really important point. And it brings us to the question of rhetoric and how language can be used to justify violence. Because yesterday, Donald Trump made some pretty shocking remarks about Liz Cheney. He actually suggested, well, I don't even want to repeat it.
His exact words during an interview with Tucker Carlson were, "Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her. Okay? Let's see how she feels about it, when the guns are trained on her face."
Wow. That language is so visceral, and given the historical context we've been discussing, it's incredibly unsettling.
It's important to note that Cheney herself connected Trump's rhetoric to the tactics of dictators.
Right.
She stated that this is how dictators destroy free nations. They threaten those who speak against them with death.
And the Washington Post article captures a range of reactions to Trump's statement. Gabrielle Giffords, who survived a horrific shooting herself, called for a rejection of violence in all its forms. Others, like former Congressman Reed Ribble, expressed concern about the impact of such language, especially on women in politics. Of course, Trump's spokeswoman defended his comments, claiming he was just pointing out Cheney's hypocrisy on war.
But regardless of intent, this incident raises serious questions about the limits of acceptable political discourse. When a former president with a huge platform uses that kind of language, it normalizes violence and has a chilling effect on open debate.
Absolutely. And it takes us back to that earlier point about how rhetoric can shape a climate, even if the speaker doesn't intend for their words to be taken literally.
Right. It creates a space where violence becomes thinkable, even acceptable. And that's incredibly dangerous, especially in a democracy.
It makes you wonder about the responsibility of leaders to choose their words carefully and the potential consequences when they fail to do so.
And it also makes us think about our own responsibility as citizens to push back against this kind of rhetoric, to make it clear that it's not okay.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I'm already seeing some interesting parallels emerging between these historical examples and what's happening in our own time.
And that's really the point of this deep dive, isn't it? To help you connect the dots, see the patterns, and understand the deeper implications of what might seem like isolated incidents.
Exactly. We're not just here to recount the past. We're here to help you make sense of the present.
It's amazing how often they resort to the same playbook. From dictators to democratically elected leaders, they
Yeah.
use violence, or at least the threat of violence, to silence dissent and maintain their grip on power.
Yeah, it's like this toxic cycle that keeps repeating itself throughout history.
Right.
I mean, think back to Franco's claim that he was restoring order, or Stalin's insistence that he was purging enemies of the people. I mean, those justifications sound eerily familiar, don't they?
Absolutely, they do. And those narratives are so effective because they play on people's fears. They offer a simple solution to a complex problem, eliminate the perceived threat, and everything will be fine.
Right.
But history shows us again and again that this approach is not only morally wrong, but also incredibly destructive.
Right. It creates this atmosphere of fear where people are afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge, those in power. And that's how democracies start to crumble, isn't it? Little by little.
Yeah, little by little, those freedoms we take for granted
Right.
start to erode away.
Yeah. It's a cautionary tale that we can't afford to ignore. We can't just be passive observers. We have to actively defend democratic values and call out those who use violence or the threat of violence to achieve their political goals.
And remember that words have power. They can incite, they can provoke, and they can, in some cases, lead to real-world violence.
Trump's comments about Liz Cheney are a perfect example of this.
Yeah.
Even if he didn't literally mean for her to be harmed, those words create a dangerous climate. They legitimize the idea of violence against political opponents.
Absolutely. And they embolden those who are already predisposed to such actions. We've seen it play out countless times throughout history, where hateful rhetoric fuels real-world violence.
So where does this leave us?
Yeah.
I think one takeaway is that we need to be incredibly discerning about the information we consume. I mean, we're bombarded with news and opinions from all sides. It can be tough to sort through the noise and find the truth.
Yeah, develop those critical thinking skills.
Right.
Question assumptions and consider multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
And be wary of those who peddle fear and division, for their own gain.
Totally agree. We have to hold our leaders accountable regardless of their political affiliation and demand that they adhere to basic standards of decency and respect, even when engaging with their opponents.
The fact that Franco's legacy is being challenged, that the truth about his regime is being brought to light, is a testament to the power of human resilience.
Yeah. It shows that even the most brutal regimes can't completely erase the truth. The fight for justice and accountability might be long and arduous, but it can ultimately prevail.
Each of us has a role to play in shaping the course of history.
Yeah.
We're not just passive passengers. We have the power to choose a different path, to build a world where violence isn't the answer, and those in power are held accountable for their actions.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think we all need to hear.
And it brings us back to that question we posed earlier. How much does rhetoric matter? I think the answer is clear. Words have the power to inspire, to heal, to unite, but they also have the power to divide, to incite, and to destroy. It's up to each of us to choose how we use that power.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about that surprising statistic about executions declining under Franco as his regime became more institutionalized. It's almost like a paradox, isn't it?
It is, and it speaks to the complexities of power and violence. On the one hand, it's tempting to think that the more power a regime has, the more brutal it will become. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the very act of creating systems, even systems of repression, can lead to unintended consequences.
Right. It's like the banality of evil, right?
Right.
The idea that these atrocities aren't always carried out by, mustache-twirling villains, but by people working within systems, following orders, perhaps even convincing themselves that they're doing the right thing.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these systems, to understand how they operate, and to challenge them when they become instruments of injustice. It's not enough to just condemn the individuals involved.
Right.
You have to address the underlying structures that make such violence possible.
Yeah, this has been a lot to process. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the darkness of these historical examples, but I also want to hold on to that sense of hope that you mentioned earlier.
We have to acknowledge the darkness, learn from the mistakes of the past,
Right.
but also believe in our ability to create a better future.
Right.
And that starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own words and actions.
It sounds like you're saying that understanding history isn't just about looking back. It's also about looking forward. It's about using the lessons of the past to inform our choices in the present and to build a more just and equitable future.
Precisely. The past isn't just a collection of stories. It's a source of wisdom that can guide us as we navigate the challenges of our own time. The more we understand history, the more equipped we are to shape the future we want to see.
It's kind of wild, isn't it? I mean, firing squads, it's not just dictators like Hitler or Stalin. It's even democratically elected governments
Yeah.
have used them, right, to eliminate their opponents.
Yeah.
Like the British government's actions during the Irish Rebellion are a stark reminder of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it challenges our assumptions about, who resorts to these methods and why. We think of firing squads as something out of a history book, but we've seen that they've been used in relatively recent times, and the rhetoric that justifies this violence is still with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the language Trump used when he talked about Liz Cheney. It's chilling how casually he invoked the image of her, facing a firing squad. It echoes the language dictators have used throughout history to dehumanize their opponents.
Yeah, it's a pattern. I think once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. Whether it's Franco's enemies of the state or Stalin's enemies of the people, there's this thread of, labeling certain groups as threats that need to be eliminated for the good of the nation.
Right. And that kind of rhetoric, it creates a climate
Yeah.
where violence becomes thinkable, acceptable. It's a slippery slope that we need to be wary of.
For sure.
So for me, the most surprising thing we talked about was that a statistic about executions declining under Franco as his regime became more institutionalized is like a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are complexities that challenge our assumptions.
Right. I mean, it doesn't make the Franco regime any less horrific,
Yeah.
but it makes you think about the different ways that power and violence can manifest. It's a lot to process. I gotta admit, I'm feeling a little uneasy knowing that the potential for this kind of violence is still out there, even in places that we might consider democratic.
It's an important takeaway, though, right? We can't afford to be complacent about this stuff. We need to be vigilant about defending democratic values and calling out dangerous rhetoric, holding our leaders accountable for their words and actions.
To wrap this deep dive up, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've explored some really dark history here, but we've also seen the resilience of those who fight for justice and how important it is to remember the past.
It's up to each of us to make sure those lessons aren't forgotten. We have to speak out against injustice and challenge those who abuse their power and work toward a world where violence is never the answer.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.